Absolute pleasure to introduce John Turborg. I've known John for a long time. John was the person I wanted to study with for my PhD. John was at Princeton. I was at lowly Boise State University. And but I don't know if John remembers, but I wrote to him when he was at his iconic Manu research station in Peru, and he wrote back to me. He said, "I was most surprised. You're the first student who's ever written to me here." Somehow the letter got there. Don't ask me how. So anyway, John did his undergraduate and postgraduate work at Harvard University. He's had a position at the University of Maryland, and then was at Princeton for a number of years, and then later left there to go to Duke University, all really prestigious universities in the US. I could go on and on about John's various recognitions and awards. So he's a member of the National Academy of Sciences in the US, which is, believe me, not easy to get into. He's won a number of important prizes, including the MacArthur Genius Award. That's a really singular recognition for any scientist in their life. So anyway, without further ado, we'd like to introduce John Turborg. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Bill, for the mercifully short introduction. I like the short introduction. Very happy to be here and to see all of you. JCU has worked its way into our hearts. Lisa and I keep coming back, and I hope we'll be able to come back some more in future years. But I want to talk today about a developing crisis in wildlife in North America. Maybe there's some lessons in this for all of you here in Australia, because some of the things that are happening are avoidable, and others are have solutions that I think are practical. So this story got started way back in the late 60s, early 70s, when some people at Rutgers University in New Jersey discovered that forest fragments had peculiar bird communities living in them. Now, forest fragments of New Jersey has the highest population density of any state in the United States. And what's left of the forest there are these farm woodlots. They're tracts of a few acres to maybe 10 or 20 acres that had been left from centuries past. They were old, mature habitat, and they should have had certain definable bird communities, and they found these communities had eroded away, and a lot of the birds have been replaced by birds of suburbs, open fields, brushlands, edges, and so forth. So these were unnatural, and that set off a long period of research on what we call forest fragments. What was going wrong in forest fragments to completely alter their bird communities? And from my perspective, the end of that period came when I published this book in 1989, by which time I thought we knew something about this. And the explanations come straight out of this famous article by Graham Cawley, your countryman here, a very distinguished biologist and conservationist, who wrote this article as his presidential address for the British Ecological Society. Well, if you read that summary at the bottom, that has the essence of it. Conservation biology has two threads: the small population paradigm, which deals with the effect of smallness on the persistence of a population. This has to do with inbreeding and sex ratios and things that are a problem only when the population down to the tiniest remnants and on the verge of extinction. So that's very well, but it's not terribly of interest to us, because you want to rescue a population before it gets there. And the declining population paradigm, which deals with the cause of smallness and its cure. Well, Cawley in this article says small population syndrome, no problem. We have theory to cover all this, and it's pretty straightforward. Declining population paradigm is a void. We don't understand it. There are many possible causes, and it's very difficult to generalize. You can find specific cases that apply to individual species, but trying to generalize more broadly than that has proven elusive. And I think it's fair to say that we're still at that point in conservation biology. Declining populations are often losing ground for completely non-obvious reasons. Well, if you go back to forest fragments and my 1989 book, I pointed the finger at two bad actors. One of them, avian nest parasites, the brown-headed cowbirds you see there, and mesopredators. Champion mesopredator we have is the raccoon. At the time, I thought I had got a grasp on the problem and that these were the essence of it. But as time went on, it was clear that wasn't the case, because with changing agricultural practices, the numbers of cowbirds in North America plummeted. They're scarce enough now that they're not a problem anymore. And we still have mesopredators, but they're no worse now than they were then. So I think there have to be other things happening. Fortunately, I was very fortunate after I moved to Duke, to be able to buy a little piece of property right in the middle of this big tract forest, about 1,000 hectares of unbroken forest. That is Duke Forest. The Duke University has an experimental forest. And so that should be a place where these problems of fragmentation were not manifest. And that was a great disillusionment. It was a great disillusionment to find out that birds were still disappearing. And so Lisa and I lived there in the 90s and up till recently. So I have a 20-year record from 1993 to 2022 of the birds I could detect right from our house. And what you see there is a list of what we call long distance migrants. These fragmentation effects particularly affected long distance migrants. Those are birds that come to North America, breed, and then go spend the rest of the year in the tropics. The fact that they migrate means that their nesting season is somewhat contracted, so they can only mostly bring off one brood a year, whereas resident birds, an equal number, but they're not listed here, can often nest 3 or 4 times. So if there are problems in the environments that are affecting nesting, they're going to particularly hit these long distance migrants. Well, you see that there's, over the 20-year period, we lost half of the species. And every year in the spring, as the migration time approached, Lisa remembers my comment on this always, what bird are we going to lose this year? What bird that we've had all along is just not going to show up this year? And many, many years, it was another species, and then another species, and then another species. Once a bird dropped out of the community, it never reestablished. So these are things that are ongoing. The last date there is this year. So I suspect that we'll start losing species off that list on the right, because several of them are already so scarce, they're just barely hanging on. So what is going on? There's a major, well-known news anchor on one of our TV stations who always asks the question, why has this happened? Well, that's what I want to talk about for the rest of the time. But first, another little anecdote I showed in this. This is a picture of the beautiful landscape of the Adirondack State Park in northern New York State. New York is a highly populous state, but more than 100 years ago, it had the wisdom to create a 2 million acre park in the mountainous north. And so it's been intact and preserved ever since. 2 of my closest colleagues, who are both ornithologists and conservationists, went up to this mountain just a year before this one to hear the thrush chorus. Now, North American thrushes have beautiful songs, and the Adirondacks are about the only place in the continent where there are 5 species. There's a wood thrush, veery, the hermit thrush, the Swainson's thrush, gray-cheeked thrush. All of them have exquisite songs. And so it is a special treat to go into the forest and walk up a mountain, and here they stagger elevationally, the wood thrush on the bottom, gray-cheeked on the top, and to hear these thrush songs. Well, my friends came back and they were stunned. They were stunned. They made the whole trip. They didn't hear a single thrush. All they heard was silence. So things are, and that's, you see, this is 2 million acres of near wilderness. So something is really, really wrong. Now, there's part 2 of this. I'm going to talk about the data that support this personal interaction with nature, in which everything seems to be gone, and possible causes of 2 types, what I call direct impacts and indirect impacts. Direct impacts are things that kill birds directly. Indirect impacts are chain reactions in which one perturbation affects something else that affects birds. So let's look at some of the evidence. This is from an article that was spearheaded by the people at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and was reported in Science in 2019, and is based on a massive amount of citizen science, data collected by amateur ornithologists, bird watchers in every state. It's a huge enterprise. It's called Breeding Bird Survey. I won't go into the details, but it generates it. There's over 1,000, maybe over 2,000 of these individual efforts are all pooled together in a huge database. And it's been going for 50 years, starting around 1970, and continuing through the present. And you can see on the left the steady decline of the total bird numbers as recorded by these citizen science efforts. And that refers to the entire continent, United States and Canada together. Now, looking over that, the scaling of this is a little funny. It's in billions of birds, and it goes from 0 to -3 billion birds. Well, those are unusual numbers to be using in this kind of context, but if the estimate that they give is that the breeding population of North American birds is roughly 10 billion. So if 3 billion have been lost since 1970, that's 30% of the total breeding population birds. Now in C, let's look over at C. It breaks down into the various communities that occupy different habitats across North America. You see coasts and arid lands, eastern forests, all the way down to grasslands. Grasslands have been hit the hardest. They've lost more than half the individuals. Part of that is habitat loss, but part of it is not habitat loss. Every one of those ecosystems or biotypes has lost birds except for wetlands, and wetlands have increased. Why should they increase? Well, it's because of the history. There's been overhunting, and there have been better environmental laws about protecting wetlands and restoring wetlands. And so there's been an uptick in wetland birds, but essentially all terrestrial birds are in decline. In D, those pie diagrams indicate the fraction of species in each of those environments that is declining, and about the best is half, and some are up, like grasslands, up to 3/4 of the species are in decline. Now, we could look at this in another way, in terms of groups of birds rather than habitats. And so you can see the sparrows, there's warblers, blackbirds. I know these are probably not very familiar to a lot of you. We have a completely different avifauna. But a very large fraction of all the birds are in decline. At the bottom are a few groups that stand out because they're not declining. Turkeys and grouse. Well, turkeys were a rare bird when I was a kid, and now they've proliferated. Turkeys are all over the country, and raptors were, when I was a kid, were considered vermin, and any kid with a gun shot every hawk he saw. Well, that practice has gone away. It's been made illegal, and it's just cultural evolution. We don't do that anymore. So raptors have come back in a big way. Some of these game birds have come back. Ducks and geese have come back for many of the same reasons. But then at the bottom, vireos have increased. Well, vireos are little insectivorous birds that live in the forest, and all other little insectivorous birds that live in the forest are in decline, but vireos are increasing. That's mysterious. I can't tell you why. Just very unsuspected and surprising. Here's yet another take on this. In a document that came out exactly the same year, 2019, it's a counterpart effort by our Canadian neighbors. And so these are data from Canada, and by and large, they show the same thing. It's also from 1970 to 2015, I guess was the last year in their compilation. You see waterfowl and birds of prey have gone up. Shorebirds, which nest in Canada, but hardly in the United States. Grassland birds, minus 57%. But the worst affected are aerial insectivores. Swallows, you call them martins, nightjars, swifts are way, way, way down. I can verify that from my own experience. You hardly see any of these birds anymore. Swallows got to be rare. Forest birds are doing better in Canada because most of the forest in Canada is this great belt of boreal forest that extends from the Atlantic to the Pacific and is very little populated or even disturbed. And so things are in the boreal forest are apparently holding their own, but in the more complex multi-species kinds of forests we have in the United States, things are really not good for forest birds. So I said I was going to look into causes. Here's the evidence. The evidence is pretty clear. Canadian data in general agree with North American data. So as for direct impacts, there's nothing more direct than this. These are birds that were picked up during migration time at the foot of the World Trade Center in New York on 20th September, which is peak time for fall migration. And you can see there are lots of little warblers and thrushes and grosbeak and a flicker, a woodpecker in the upper left. Birds hit tall buildings and then just drop dead onto the sidewalk. And the toll is particularly large in cloudy nights because then the lights of the building confuse and disorient the migration, the navigation systems of the birds, and they fly towards the lights and hit the building. And then so cloudy or foggy nights are the worst. So this is a major impact on bird numbers, and it's an impact that's a matter of scale. We have 330 million people in the United States, and as a result of that, there are lots and lots of buildings and cities and places where this is happening. So you're lucky here, you have 25 million people, and so the opportunity for birds to hit buildings is proportionately less, but it's very high in North America, where, as you can see, Chicago is just full of high buildings. Well, this is work done by a former friend who was a graduate student at Princeton when I was here, David Willard, this fellow up here. He went out for 20 years every day during migration period to pick up dead birds around this McCormick Palace. It's a big convention center on the shore of Lake Michigan in Chicago. to collect birds. And what he found was that, yeah, on certain nights during migration, this is the upper part of the diagram, there were lots and lots of dead birds. Well, those were the cloudy nights where lights could confuse the birds and lure them into the building where they'd hit the glass and fall down. But so you see that the kill of birds is highly variable. A lot of nights, very little, and then there would be these big peaks when the conditions were adverse for migration. The lower half of the diagram shows radar data that can estimate roughly how many birds are passing by, and you see that there are a lot more birds migrating over Chicago in the fall and in the spring, and that is because the birds go north, they have babies, and in the fall they come back with all the babies, and so the number is much greater. But by the next spring, because there's a lot of mortality during migration and in the winter, the number goes down again. So these building strikes are a serious source of bird mortality, and they're largely provoked by lighting. So in 2000, David and his colleagues at the Field Museum persuaded the managers of the McCormick Palace to curtail their lighting as much as possible, and especially on these cloudy, foggy nights. And you can see after they started controlling the lighting, the bird mortality went down to less than half. So that was a very key part of the building strikes that were killing thousands of birds. But then the difficulty, the challenge of applying that across a city the size of Chicago, much less cities elsewhere in the country. As you can see, scaling that up is not easy. So similarly, insects are attracted to light at night and pound themselves on the glass, and you can see they're falling to the street there in thousands and thousands. This is a picture, a very dramatic one that appeared in Science on insect ecology. Insects of some aquatic species like these mayflies can emerge from their larval lives in the water in absolutely enormous numbers, and then they can die in very large numbers. That's just to mention that lights are detrimental, not just the birds, but the insects, sea turtles, and various other things. This now we can try to quantify this as this little group of researchers headed up by Peter Marr has done, to try to estimate total mortality of birds resulting from building strikes. And I won't go into all the mechanics of their model, but it includes several parameters that have to be estimated in ranges of possible values of those parameters. And if you randomize the selection of quantitative values out of these ranges of variation and combine them, you can and do it over and over and over and over again, you get a whole lot of estimates of what the model can predict. And so you see in the bottom there, it predicts about 600 million birds are dying every year due to building strikes. So it is a major source. I don't think it is the most serious source, but it's definitely a major source. Well, building strikes are one thing and vehicle strikes are another. I won't say much about this, except estimates have been made both by the Mara group, that's the top article, and the group in Europe. And they come out more or less in the same ballpark. You can see there in the text that the estimate for Europe was about 200 million birds. The estimate for North America was somewhere between 100 and 350 million. And so 200 to 250 lies sort of in the middle of that range. So I think these are underestimates. We have about 250 million registered vehicles on the road in the United States. And if each of them hits one bird a year, that will be 250 million birds killed. I think I hit 2, 3. I think 1 is a low estimate. And the way these data were generated was to have observers go along and patrol stretches of road and look for dead birds in the road margins. Well, not every bird that hits a vehicle is going to wind up in the road margin. Often they flutter off and they're in the vegetation somewhere, and you won't ever find them. So I think these are probably low estimates for roadkill. But if you add up roadkill and building strikes, you're in the range of 1 billion birds a year getting killed by these unavoidable aspects of our lifestyle. And so they're going to be somewhat hard to suppress. Now, the diseases, I'm going to say very much about diseases because I think in the larger picture, diseases are a small part of it. We have a problem with this chytridiosis of amphibians, and no North American species have completely disappeared yet, but a lot of species in the mountains of Costa Rica and in the northern Andes in South America have, for all the ability of people to find them, gone extinct. Especially the Harlequin frogs, beautiful colored frogs in the genus Atelopus, they've become extremely scarce. There are this white nose disease of bats, been a matter of great concern for a decade or more now. Bats, especially with bats that hibernate in caves because they gather together and pass the spores from one to the next, so that it's highly contagious. And then we have this West Nile virus that affects certain birds, particularly corvids, crows, and jays, but only a few species. Well, with diseases, there's usually one of two outcomes. Either disease is lethal, there's no genetic resistance in the population, sweeps through disease, the species goes extinct. That's what's happened with these Atelopus frogs in Central and South America with the batrachiochitridiosis, what a word. Otherwise, there will be susceptible and resistant, genetically susceptible and resistant individuals in the population. The susceptible individuals be largely taken out, and the resistant ones will replenish the population. So I think this is a pulse phenomenon, that is something that can knock a population down on a short time scale, but it's not the bigger picture. It's not the bigger picture. Climate change. Again, I'm not going to talk much about climate change because it's a squishy kind of problem. Kudos to Bill there. This is he's been writing about it too. But I say it's a squishy kind of problem because in reality, it's very difficult to separate, to isolate the effect of climate change from the effects of all these other things that I'm going to talk about. There's no clean mechanism that I can think of, or anybody else has thought of yet, for this separating the component of total mortality that's due to climate change, to building strikes, to these various other causes I'll be talking about. So yes, I think climate change is important. The loss of synchrony between breeding and resources that is affecting some bird populations. Yes, that's serious, that's real. But again, like resistance to a pathogen, that's something that selects for changed behavior. And I think a lot of species are just going to adjust to these things. It's a shock, it sets things back at the beginning, but evolution can help take care of it. Now, indirect causes. Very ranking high among these are a predator, mesopredator release and hyperabundance to a degree that the prey they're taking is really seriously impacted. This is, of course, a picture from Australia where cats are a notorious issue in mammalian conservation. But we have feral cats too. In fact, estimates run between 30 and 80 million feral cats in the United States. And the Mera group is estimated by means I described, the annual mortality due to feral cats, free-ranging domestic cats, is the way they describe them. Well, you see, they predict 2.4 billion. Well, that's way above building strikes of road strikes together. That's a really serious big number. Even worse for small mammals, 12 billion. I'm going to tell you something that may sound heretical, but even if that's a correct number, I don't think it's a big problem. It doesn't threaten the extinction of any North American birds. Why is that? It's because free-ranging cats in the United States, nearly all of them are associated in one way or another with human beings. A lot of them are sort of surreptitiously cared for by sympathetic people who put out food for them, provide subsidies. We have that in our own neighborhood in Florida. We see it going on. And so the small subsidies can maintain a large population of cats. But if you go out into the truly natural habitat, what we have left of really more or less intact natural areas, I challenge you to find a feral cat. I have never seen one in a really natural area. They don't go out there. And so the cat problem may be big. I'm not sure it's as big as they claim it is, but it's confined to areas where cats are able to interact in a way that favors them with humans. Why do I think what I've told you is true? Well, it's because of this. We have the coyote, you have the dingo. And I think you should love your dingoes the way we should love our coyotes. Actually, we hate them. And that's a problem. People shoot coyotes, there's no limits. They're considered vermin, just as all hawks were when I was a kid. People are afraid of them. They kill some livestock. So coyotes are an enemy of the people, but nevertheless, they're extremely wily, and they are now in all the 48 states, except for they're not in Hawaii and maybe only a toehold in Alaska, but every other state has coyotes, and that's a fairly recent development. Well, coyotes, as the figure shows, eat cats, and where there are coyotes, there aren't any cats. Cats can't survive in the presence of coyotes. And so coyotes are protecting our wilder areas, the areas that are farther from human habitations, from cats. And so you see the cat has a very wide diet: lizards, frogs, squirrels, birds, rabbits, mice. The coyote eats mammals. And so the birds and the frogs and the lizards are given a reprieve when coyotes are around and drive the cats to very, very low numbers. Now this is, so I don't think cats, even though Mara and company estimate 2.5 billion a year, are really going to drive anything extinct. Another issue that is due to a lack of normality in our fauna, the lack of top predators in this case, is the effects of ungulate overbrowsing. Ungulates have become extremely numerous. We have up to 40, 50 deer per square kilometer in some parts of the United States. These are enormous densities. And at that density, they do huge damage. We also have feral pigs, as you do here, and they do great damage too. And if you look at this on the left, there's an area that's about as covers the whole picture that has been worked over by feral pigs. And you see there's very little vegetation. There's all sorts of the clods of dirt and roots are turned over, and it's a mess. No grassland bird could ever accept that as suitable for nesting. But after pig control, in 1 year, the same place looks like this beautiful prairie, which would be fine habitat for nesting grassland birds. but you can't control hogs over the, the enormity of the area that they occupy in the US. Similarly, deer are a huge problem. On the left, you see what a forest, a deciduous forest in mid-latitude in North America ought to look like. It's a very leafy green place. There are trees and small saplings and shrubs and herbaceous plants and an abundance of foliage that prevents your seeing through it more than just a few meters. This is in a national, the picture was taken in national forest. That was at Croton, where there's open season and where the hunters are pretty successful in keeping the deer numbers down. But on the right is an area very near to where we live in Florida, in a community that doesn't do anything to control its deer. In fact, they seem to love their deer, and they're in front yards of every other house. The deer just stand by the side of the road as you go by, and look at what they do. They just eat out the vegetation entirely. Well, this is completely ruinous for birds that nest near on the ground, because to raise young effectively, they have to be able to conceal their nests from predators. And if they have a nice leafy environment like the one on the left, they can find suitable sites where their comings and goings to the nest will be very difficult for a predator to observe. But when it's defoliated the way it is on the right, that's impossible. So we've lost a lot of birds that nest near and on the ground due to this problem of feral animals. But now I'm going to come to the final chapter in this story, which is about what the New York Times calls insect apocalypse. And this, I think, is the bottom. This is the real problem. And it's a problem we haven't started to do anything about all yet. I think it's not even adequately recognized. But insects are disappearing from our environment, from the world we live in. That seems like a radical statement, but I'll show you it's not that far off, not much of an exaggeration. But before I go on with the next slide, I want to mention that little insert on the right. How many here recognize what's in the front of that car? Did they have them here? Bill recognized them. I don't know if they ever had them here. David does. We used to call them bug screens. When I was young, say in the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s, insects were so plentiful all across North America in the summer months that you could not drive through a rural area without having your windshield plastered with the bodies and the goo of insects, and without having so many insects enter through your grill into the radiators that they plug up the radiators so that your car would overheat. That's how many insects there were. So nearly anybody who was doing any driving in the rural areas, it got one of these bug screens to protect their radiators from overheating. Well, the younger generation has never seen one of these things. They went out of use probably before 1980, and I don't think you could buy one if you begged for it. They just don't exist anymore. That's just a memory, but it's a memory that's still fresh with us old timers. And I can tell you, the world ain't the way it used to be. It's not just because we don't need insect screens, but because of all that implies. Now, this is the data out of an article that really brought this to world attention. It's a group in Germany that did very intensive work. They claim to have counted and identified, tallied more than 1 million individual insects. They worked at 150 grassland sites, 146 forest sites, and surveyed insects over a 10-year period from 2008 to 2017. And those lines, you've got to be careful about the scales. Some of them are log scales, and that upper trio of of insect figures, but the first one is biomass. That's down about 60%. Abundance is down 75%. Species richness is down similarly, drastically. This was a very carefully conducted study on a large scale, and it really rang alarm bells. But as our news anchor, Chris Hayes says, why is this happening? And I wish I could tell you. I wish I could tell you. This is the reality we're living with. It accords completely with the fact we don't need bug screens anymore, and with a lot of other data. Now, it's hard to get people excited about insects. Most people think they're good insects, like bees and butterflies. Bees do useful things. Butterflies are pretty, and they're bad insects, like mosquitoes and horseflies. And the rest of them, well, they don't count much, but they do. Look, they're incredible diversity, variety, and functions. And they have huge ecological importance, as Ed Wilson never got tired of telling people. But so why are they declining? The fact that they are declining is now being widely substantiated. Not why, but just the fact of it. And these bars there, different colored bars, represent what is 73 reports of insect declines. You can see that mostly biggest concentration is in Europe. There are quite a few in North America. I'm sorry to say the Southern Hemisphere does not come off well in this comparison. Very, very few results from anywhere yet in the Southern Hemisphere. There's another collection of these before and after surveys, and the red dots in the upper part of the diagram show declines, the blue ones increases. Well, the reds vastly outnumber the blues. In the lower part of the diagram, it's freshwater insects, and reds and blues are more equal. There seems to be something different happening there. It's terrestrial environment that is affected the worst. I put this up here because this is, in a way, epitomizes the crux of the problem. Why are insects declining? Well, this tells us death by 1,000 cuts. It's the disruption of interactions. It's fire, it's storms, it's global warming, droughts, nitrification, pollution, introduced species, urbanization. If you took that to Congress, they would laugh you out of the house, because you can't go and say, we have a huge problem that has 20 different causes. You'll get nowhere with that politically, just zero. So we've got to do better than that. Yes, all that is probably true, but I had a colleague at Princeton, a very brilliant fellow, who did very advanced mathematical analysis. And he always said, if you have a problem that is driven by a lot of different causal variables, a lot of different causal variables are involved, almost invariably, one or two of them will be the main drivers, and the rest of them make small contributions that mostly you can ignore. So the problem we face now with this is to identify the main drivers. And I think we're getting there. I think we're getting there. They're pesticides. They're pesticides. Now there's a new group of pesticides in very wide use all over the world now. They're called Neo-Nicotinoids. They first came on the market around 1990. They replaced prior generations of insecticides as insects got better and better at evolving resistance. So the farmers were clamoring for new chemicals that would replace these earlier ones that were losing their potency. So these neonicotinoids came out, and they are now in enormous use. There's a whole family of these things, maybe 8 or 10 or a dozen different chemical formulations that are sold under different names, that are used for different purposes and sold in different countries. But this one that's on the diagram, this imidacloprid, is the leading one. It is $1 billion a year industry. That's a B. And so the companies that produce it have a huge amount of financial clout that they can use to lobby against any action to curtail their business. So what you see there is the very heavy use of imidacloprid over the entire corn belt in the United States. The article claims that there's almost no corn grown anywhere in the United States that isn't protected with this imidacloprid. We don't know what this compound does to wildlife, how concentrated it comes in the environment. It's applied as a coating to seeds. The seeds are then sown, planted in the ground, and when they germinate, they take up the Neo-Nicotinoid, and it goes up through the vascular system and into their leaves, and their leaves become toxic, and insects can't eat the plant. But what happens to that toxin? It leaches into the soil. It goes from the soil out to the water supply. Pretty soon it's everywhere. It's just everywhere because it's applied on such an enormous scale. The evidence needed to show conclusively so you could get congressional action out of that imidacloprid and other neonicotinoids are responsible for declining birds. Boy, have you got a big job there. And I can tell you that's going to be a big job because all of you, I think, have heard of Silent Spring, the book by Rachel Carson that came out in 1954 and pointed the finger at DDT as having consequent effects on the reproductive success of some birds, our eagles, ospreys, pelicans, and some other birds. Well, I knew some of the people involved in this research. It took 10 years of very intense research to join the dots, every single dot between application of DDT to eggshell thinning to bird nesting failure. You had to make a case that would stand up in a court of law. Congress wouldn't pay attention to you. So it took 10 years of very, very serious and intense research before we got DDT banned. We haven't even started with the neonicotinoids. We're not even at square one yet. So what convinces me that this is really the solution to the problem are these data that came out in Nature very recently. It went back to that paper of Rosenberg and all that I showed you before, that science paper that had the 3 billion birds decreasing over 50 years. Well, they took it for all the individual species and asked, does this bird depend on insects in its lifestyle? Does it feed insects to babies or insects, a critical factor in its diet, or does the bird live on other things? And you can see there, that the result is spectacular. Birds that don't use insects are unaffected. They have no problem at all. They're just zero. They're not going up, they're not going down, everything's fine and steady. But birds that consume insects just drastically decline. So I think that's enough to convince me. It may not convince a lawyer, it may not convince some of our skeptical members of Congress, but boy, does this convince me. So these pesticides are really the bottom line of this story, and it gets worse and worse. We're now discovering what we call forever chemicals. These are chemicals that have toxic effects, that have unknown consequences on wildlife and other aspects of the environment, but they don't decompose. They stay in the environment forever because they're resistant to enzymes and bacterial and fungal activity. And so these things are very frightening too. Legal obstacles to toxic chemical research. Well, after DDT, the more conservative members of our Congress changed the law so that it's not any longer necessary to do a lot of testing on animals, plants, in aquatic organisms, all the things that can be affected by toxins that are thrown out into the environment. It's no longer necessary to do all that research and evaluation before a substance is licensed. You license it first. That's a front-end approach, as it says. You license it first, and then if later down the road, if you discover, oh, we've got problems, yeah, you can see the picture. It gets really difficult to do anything about it. So that is the way our law reads. And now we're seeing this in other countries around the world. Well, of course, Bolsonaro in Brazil is a tyrant and a nightmare for everybody. And but he has done that too. He has lifted Brazilian regulations. They can now apply almost anything, including substances that are banned in other countries, can be freely applied in Brazil. And so here you have it. It's happening not just in the US, it's happening elsewhere. Industry drives this, and the citizens are almost helpless to oppose it because we don't have the data, the hard facts, the connecting of the dots to show that these things are really doing serious harm to us. So this adds up Armageddon. What do we do? What do we do? Well, I think the scientific community needs to pull itself together and mount a major effort. I mean, it's something, I put it like a Manhattan Project. That was the project produced the atomic bomb in World War II, but we need something like that. It's a multidisciplinary problem. There are lots of aspects to it, as I think I've made clear to you. There are many different types of chemicals that are being strewn about in the environment. It's not just Neo-Nicotinoids. There are a lot of other things, these forever chemicals and more that I don't know about and none of us know about. But at the end, in order to get effective political action to solve some of these problems, the science community has to pull together an airtight case, a defensible case, showing cause and effect and direct connections between them. But we have a long ways to go before that. So that's where we are. I'm sorry to say, I wish it were better, but those of you who are fortunate enough to live here, knowing this in advance, may be able to fend off some of it, not wallow in the worst of it the way we are in the US. So thank you a lot for your attention. It's great and glad to be here.